Hello and welcome to Ahead of the Game. I'm your host, James Oxford, and today we'll be discussing what players could fit well on the Hornets in this year's draft. Joining us today are Alex West and Chris Filer. Alex, how about you give us a quick review of the Hornets season?
Absolutely, James. It has not been a great season. I think that goes without saying. 21 and 61, 13th in the East. They have the fourth best lottery odds leading into the lottery here in a couple of weeks. It was a difficult season in terms of injuries. A lot of games lost for LaMelo Ball. A lot of games lost for Mark Williams. They had 313 games lost to injury. That was third in the league. They had 20 players start a game and 26 players played in 5 or more games. So a ton of players kind of filtered through. They were 30th in point differential, 27th in points per 100, 28th in defensive points per 100, 30th in free throw rate, which I think is relevant, and 27th in transition frequency. And those last 2 points kind of lend themselves to LaMelo Ball missed a lot of games, so possibly there's something there, missing that lead guard element. But there's a lot for them to look to improve on. I also think this was a massive year of transition. They changed ownerships. They changed the head of their basketball operations department. They're going to change their coach. At this point, they have not done that. But to go from MJ, Kupchak, Steve Clifford to Plotkin and Schnall to Jeff Peterson to whomever they decide to be a coach, I think this is a really big year for this new ownership group to put their stamp on what they want to do. And as a result, I think there are guys who are probably not safe from the old regimes. I mean, obviously the book night pick didn't work out the way they wanted it to, but I think there are guys who are going to be more readily evaluated that the new ownership group is not going to be afraid to cut bait on. And draft picks wise, they owe a lottery protected first to San Antonio. It's lottery protected this draft and next draft. If it doesn't convey by 25, it turns into 2 seconds. They owe an unprotected second to Portland, which is like the 33rd pick in the draft right now. And they're getting an unprotected second from Houston, which is 42. This offseason, they're going to have about $26 million in cap space. They could have as much as 38. We all know what the market for free agents is and the names that are available. So it'll be interesting to see how they fill that out. Chris, I'm going to throw it over to you. I want to talk about the pieces they need to build around, who maybe they need more information to see if these players are somebody they want to build around.
All right. Yeah, I think that the foundational pieces really are LaMelo Ball and Brandon Miller. I think that there are other guys on the team who might be worth considering when, they're looking at these prospects. I mean, when we're looking at these guys this year, Mark Williams is the name that comes to mind for me as someone who, he's not foundational. He's probably a role player in the NBA if he really pans out over time. But I'm intrigued, and I think the Hornets probably are too. He's been a really, really good rim protector. He's a good offensive rebounder, and he's a piece that I think because of the nature of what he does, you have to consider when drafting. Unless you really don't like him, or you really like a Donovan Clingan type, you're never going to put them on the court together. They'll never share a front court. They don't fit. They're both rim running, center of the defense, kind of rim protecting guys. There'd be no spacing. There's no hope that either one of those guys is ever going to be really an outside shooter. You never bank on that. He's a kind of player that unless you think the replacement is going to be fantastic, and you're about as sure as you can be, you wouldn't replace him probably, or at least I wouldn't. So I think really the key players on this team when you're looking at who to draft and you're considering are LaMelo, Brandon Miller, and Mark Williams. But Miller and LaMelo, they fit around other guys. So you can never have too many wings. They both kind of fit out. They're both 6'7", 6'8", and they, you can always add more wings to the team. You could have little guards. You could have big wings, medium wings. Those two guys can shoot. They can pass. They're going to mold around other players. Mark Williams is the one that I think really needs to be considered when you're potentially drafting maybe a center at this spot.
Yeah, I want to get kind of hot takey here at the top and talk about, are we sure that LaMelo Ball is a foundational piece? And I say that because obviously the talent is there. This is his 4th year in Charlotte. He's played in the past 2 seasons, he's played 58 games total. out of a potential 164 or whatever. He's played 58 of them. It's been some frequent injuries, lower body stuff. He dealt with an ankle all season. He is one of those players that, like, when you look at the stat sheet, yeah, you see all the things that he does. He puts up flashy numbers. And then when you watch the tape, he's a little bit less impactful than what the numbers show to me. I don't know that necessarily makes a question of, like, is this somebody you trade? Is this somebody you move on from? But he certainly is not, I think, what we thought he could be at this stage of his career. And so I think one of the questions that Charlotte's going to contend with this offseason is, well, is LaMelo Ball a foundational piece? Because obviously Brandon Miller is. Brandon Miller, like, started slow. There was a little bit of worry, and then he just kind of surged through the year. And by the end of the year, there was a general consensus agreement, like, this is an NBA player. This is a very talented NBA player. This is a guy who could be a cornerstone for the future. If you view Miller that way, maybe you don't view Ball that way. Maybe there's a trade market for him. I don't know. I just want to put that out there as a discussion point to either of you guys, because I think it's an interesting question. I don't necessarily know that's the way they're going to go, but I think it merits consideration as you start to rebuild, because I view this as a foundational floor one rebuild, where they are starting at the bottom. So if you're starting at the bottom, how do you glean the most assets? And maybe LaMelo Ball's greatest value to them is as a trade candidate.
I'm gonna jump in and defend LaMelo here. He was the 80th percentile as a pick and roll ball handler. I think that, you're not going to find guys that put up those kind of numbers consistently very often. 59th percentile spot up, so he can play that secondary role if you need him to. He's not, someone that's stuck on ball. Where I think they're doing him a disservice is transition. 27th in transition frequency as a team, and he's only in the 5th percentile as a transition scorer. I think maybe they're just not utilizing him correctly. They need to get the ball out to, these Brandon Millers, and some of these other guys we'll maybe talk about could be a nice fit as that secondary guy to get the ball into in transition. And so I think it's going to be interesting to see how him and Brandon Miller kind of coexist when, this next season opens up, along with, whoever they add, of course, in the draft. And if they do, tip their toes into free agency waters, we'll see what they can do there too. But I definitely view LaMelo as a foundational piece, just maybe not necessarily his asset or his talents are being, utilized correctly at this point.
I'm going to jump in as well. I think that I agree with James. I think that he is foundational. I think his skills, a big wing, he's practically wing size. So a guard slash wing that has his incredible vision and scoring ability, I think is just too hard to find, to give up too easily. At the same time, he hasn't played. I mean, he just hasn't. So hypothetically, even if you didn't view him as this kind of player, as a foundational piece, I really don't think you could get anywhere close to full return for him right this second. So he is on the team. I mean, he's got, I believe, a full-blown max contract extension, and so
kicks in this year.
Right.
Yeah.
And so he's on the team, and I don't think you're going to get full value for him or anywhere close. So I'd love to see him really flesh out him and the Miller pairing, as Miller's had this chance to expand his role and really improve over the first year after LaMelo went out with the injuries. So I think that duo is really the focus here. And LaMelo, I just want to see more. I mean, he hasn't played, and he's still a really fantastic offensive player. I absolutely agree, though. He's not maybe everything he could have been at this point because of these injuries. Man, those shoes have been bad for that family, that's all I'm saying.
There are a couple other guys I want to touch on before we move on from this, just names to throw out there. You look at this roster, they made some trades midseason. They acquired Grant Williams from Dallas. They ended up with Trey Mann. Those are younger guys that I think generate value. I don't necessarily know if they're foundational or how they end up playing. Grant Williams played pretty well after not shooting well in Dallas. That's a guy that I think you're going to take for a test drive, as is Trey Mann. Trey Mann never really got the burn he was looking for in OKC, just because it was crowded. I mean, and then, the younger players were coming on. They drafted really well. Trey Mann kind of got lost in the shuffle. So I think those are two guys they want to take a look at. I also think Nick Richards is a player that they really liked this year based on just how much he played after the Mark Williams injury. He's not my favorite, but I definitely think that when you have a Mark Williams and a Nick Richards, it impacts what we're getting ready to talk about with players that you're going to draft. If you feel pretty comfortable with those two playing center, or I don't necessarily think you're going to play them together, but you at least have two bigs that you want to take for a ride this coming season.
I think that, Grant is, after, as you correctly identified, I had a rough Dallas stint, quick stint over in Dallas. He's someone I think that I would definitely keep in house. Obviously, you don't want to move on from him after he did play well there to end the season. Richards, I'm not as sold on. I think if Mark Williams is your guy, at least that you're at least somewhat planning around in the draft, then Richards at this point is probably end of the bench rotation. Although maybe he does step up next year and really impress. Very possible. Bridges obviously is the one no one wants to talk about.
Yeah, that's definitely the elephant in the room there.
Absolutely. Obviously done very, very terrible things. And if everyone had their way, he probably wouldn't be in the league right now. But given they already brought him back one time, I think it's not crazy to assume they would do so again, given the price is right. I don't know that he's going to have a very competitive free agency market. It could be a buyer's market there for the Hornets, because I don't know many teams that are willing to bring him in. I guess maybe the Thunder. Well, obviously, they're not worried about that type of stuff. So it'll be interesting to see. And, I think that next we should probably move on to the prospects. Chris, you want to go ahead and touch on how you think Alex Sarr might actually fit with this group?
Yeah, I think Sarr is really interesting. And the reason I mentioned Klingon and not Sarr earlier when talking about the fit with Mark Williams is I think Sarr has a little more versatility. And not that he's better or something like Klingon. I just think he's different. He's got a little more versatility. A lot of his game this last year was, jump shots. He focuses a lot on his spot ups. I know he was 60th percentile spot ups, plays better possession this last year for his synergy, and he really is comfortable shooting that ball. He is a quick trigger. He shot pretty well. The free throw percentage isn't great, so I have a little pause because it's about 71% over the year. But he shot pretty decently over the course of the season from outside, and I think that he is the kind of guy who maybe could slide into the 4 spot long term. He's got defensively is really where the value is for him, I think. He's not one of these Jaren Jackson, Evan Mobley, Chet Holmgren kind of intellects on defense with all the feel in the world where he's going to walk in the door and block out a shot. But he's just like a fantastic athlete. He's not, it's not Jonathan Isaac, but he's 7'1". He's got a massive wingspan. He can really leap up there. He's looking to block your shot. He's maybe not a savant on defense, but he's trying. I don't think it's a lack of awareness, and a lot of his game is just. I think the holes in his game, a lot of it is just polish issues. I think he's trying stuff. He tries to dribble. He tries to create offense. He tries to make passes, and I think that kind of offense, in a transition system with Melo and Brandon Miller, I think he could get out and run. I think he can space the court, potentially, hopefully, for a big long term. And just having that second huge rim protector, I almost think he'd be a better secondary rim protector than primary rim protector because he's not that kind of defensive savant that some of those guys are. So if you could put him next to Mark Williams and have this massive pterodactyl arm coming out of nowhere off the weak side, I think that could potentially be really good.
Chris, how do you, on that point, you're talking about the positionality of Alex Sarr, and I think that's really where the question is I think he might be a different position offensively than he is defensively, and that's something, we're going to unpack as we go through this draft season and prepare. I think he might be a little bit more of a 3 offensively. Maybe, you want to get him with the ball in his hands doing some things. He might be a little bit more of a 4 defensively. When you look at him, how does positionality, switchability, that kind of thing really settle for him? And where do you see that going, as you look at him as a prospect?
Yeah, I think defensively, I think he can be a center defensively, but I think a power forward spot where he's the secondary rim protector is really the dream spot. I mean, when he's out on the perimeter, he's not so fleet-footed that he's going to be out there locking guys up. That's just not what he does. But I think he's a good athlete, and he has so much length. I mean, his length is fantastic for someone who does have some good speed. And so I think he was learning it as the season went on. He was getting a little better at it, in that he was giving more space to the quick guard so that he had room to recover when they would try to beat him. And he's still able to generally stick with even the quicker guards when they're, because of his length, because he can still, if he gives some space, he can get back in time and block quite a few shots. So I'm less concerned about the switchability issues on defense because he's got such incredible length, and I do think he's got good general awareness on that side. Offensively, you're right. He's a spot-up shooter pretty much at this point. He's a phenomenal offensive rebounder, I will say. I mean, he is like, he's not a great box out guy, but his length and athleticism allows him to really crash the glass, and he does that. And every time he catches the ball down there, if he does get the board, it's a dunk. So I think he's in a good spot to contribute on that side. But you're right, he's a spot up shooter. I mean, the few post ups he's had this year are the same exact fade to his right every single time, and it looks okay. But he's not walking in the door as like a real post up guy. That's not happening.
I kind of want to push back on even him being a spot up guy. I hate to be the downer here. I don't really see where he fits kind of with LaMelo and Brandon Miller, except in transition. I think that as a shooter, he was at 29% on guarded catch and shoot threes, 29% on unguarded catch and shoot threes, and 25% on dribble jumper threes with Perth this season. So I mean, I struggle to see where he fits offensively as a role. He in the post, I kind of thought that he had a rudimentary post game. He just tries to go over the defender. There's not really any footwork that I saw that blew me away. And when he does try to get to footwork game, it's often just a fadeaway. So it's either over the defender or fading away, even when he had a size mismatch. And so I struggle to really see where he lays his claim offensively. Defensively, I see it. I don't think he's as switchable as, like, I saw some people online saying, he's going to be a switch defender up top. I don't see him as that. I think at the end of shot clocks, maybe under 5 seconds, under 6 seconds, you're okay doing it. But if they have the ability to pull the ball out after the switch and kind of shift it to an ISO possession, I think he's going to get beat quite a bit. And then offense, to go back to offense, Alex's point is him playing the three. I didn't see much shiftiness on the drive. It's a lot of straight line drives, and again, just trying to go over the defender from what I saw. I watched quite a bit of those possessions, so I feel pretty confident. Like, I'm not really sure where he lays his claim offensively unless the jump shot just drastically improves. I will say he had a nice little dribble pull up. It's a little bit slow at this point, but it goes in from the mid range. But other than that, I'm just really struggling to see where he fits, especially on this Hornets roster.
Yeah, I think just to clarify on that wing point, I think I'm talking about what he wants to do as tendencies. I feel like he's kind of like this guy who wants to size up. He wants to face up in a dribble. He wants to get into that catch and shoot game. Like, to me, that feels more, if you're attacking the rim face up, that feels more like a wing, like what you want to do. Who knows what he ends up being? That's really, it's like, I think there are a lot of evolutionary paths for Alex Sarr. Defensively, I think, to Chris's point, like, it's a secondary rim protection, but offensively, I feel like you can go down these different paths and you can see, well, do we develop him more as a wing? Do we develop him more as a forward? Do we like this catch and shoot game? Which direction do we take this prospect? And I think that's really what, in Charlotte, there's so much room for all those things. Like, that could be what is an interesting fit, is if they're in love with one aspect of the game, that's where they can push him to. And so I think there's a lot of positional flexibility in terms of what he could do, not what he is doing.
Right. And I would agree with that. I think the value really comes from the defense for him, just because of the size and athleticism. And then the offense is more, you're right. I mean, I think it is projection. You're talking about projection here. I think he's working hard to learn that shot, and I think it doesn't look bad. I wouldn't be shocked if he eventually is like a solid shooter in the NBA, maybe like a low 30s, mid 30s kind of guy. The evidence of that right this second is not great. I absolutely agree. But he also takes like a lot of not awesome shots. The decision making on the shot is not great. So I think in a situation where he's not asked to do a lot on offense, and he's getting set up by LaMelo Ball, who's a good passer, and Brandon Miller, same thing. So I think that's the kind of situation where he'd have a lot more open opportunities, and he's tried so much stuff at this level. Like he's been in a position where he's been able to try to flex dribbling and passing when he doesn't have that yet. I mean, he just doesn't. He's not that kind of guy right now. I think there's just, like Alex pointed out, opportunity for him to grow in a lot of different interesting ways on this team. And if the Mark Williams thing doesn't work out, you already have a guy on roster who maybe can play center in the future. I'm not sure, but again, it's projection here. But I agree, and I do think you're right, James. He's not great at this yet, but this is the kind of projection I think for this particular player. I mean, he doesn't have a lot of rim running stats this last year, and playing with LaMelo and Brandon Miller, who should help that as well. When Mark Williams is not on the court, so he's just a lot of ways he can go, I think, on offense. But right now, agreed, the defense is where the value is coming in.
So another guy I'd like to talk about that kind of has an open-ended offense at this point is Buzelis from the G League Ignite. I think his fit also is, projection at this point. So I think that I would like to see him not be used as a spot-up shooter. That is my main ask of whatever team drafts him. He just isn't a spot-up shooter. That's what it comes down to. I think that playing off ball in a role that allows him to get into the middle of the court, flash cuts, off screens, things like that, and then create quick possessions from there is the way to go with Buzelis. Just to emphasize again why he should not be used as a spot-up shooter, he was 22% on unguarded threes. Or those are catch and shoot. Let me make sure that's clear. 22% on unguarded catch and shoot threes, and a whopping 6.7% on dribble jumper threes. He is a talented player that needs to operate inside the lane lines, preferably kind of at that elbow area, maybe just outside the lane lines. I think that he has a very interesting game in that, again, he's not someone that you want as your primary ball handler, but he's also someone that you want to touch the ball quite a bit. He was only in the 24th percentile in isolation, which I know sounds really bad, but there were some tools to work with there. And I think his main problem is he waits too long. So he was 11.2% of his possessions were in isolation. Sounds like a ton, okay? But the problem is he gets these screens, he gets to the elbow, and then he sizes up, waits to see what's going on. And instead of it being an off-screen possession, a handoff possession, whatever it might be classified otherwise, it becomes an ISO. So I think that his fit with the Hornets, the sell on him as the Hornets is he's a guy that can play off of either LaMelo or Brandon Miller in a complementary role. Is that something that you've seen, Alex, him being able to play that complementary role next to them, or do you have other thoughts?
No, I like that analysis. I think you hit on the major point is like, it's projection, it's theoretical. And I'll build on that point by saying, I think there's a theoretical off the dribble game here that's kind of interesting. Yeah, to your point, he was not a good shooter off the dribble, but I think he's really fluid in like his ability to get into catch and shoots. And you see that a little closer in. About the 15-foot mark, he's pretty good at like getting to his spot, getting into that shot, being able to create what he wants to, and being able to get space despite not blowing you away physically with his athleticism. So I think if you're looking at him as a complementary player, somebody who's going to play off the ball next to Miller and Ball, you have somebody who can get into their own game, who can attack a warp, and who can score in like sort of those conventionally unused spaces of the floor. He's got a good floater game. He gets into the paint, he touches it, but he doesn't attack the rim necessarily. It's like he's attacking from that like 8-foot range. And I think he did really well with that kind of stuff. So there's a lot to like. I do think you have to believe that you can develop him as a shooter despite what we have seen from him. I think you have to believe this is a guy who could be a catch and shoot guy or who could create off the dribble, not necessarily as a lead handler, but somebody like secondarily. I also like his defense a little bit more, I think, than maybe other people do. He's smart. I think there's some just his off-ball positioning is really good. He creates a little bit of havoc, not a ton of tip passes, but there are some there. And I think it's just his IQ and his ability to locate himself on the floor that makes him interesting. Not a guy who's going to be your POA lead, but defensively, I think there's more than what we've given him credit for. And I really like what he does. And I think most importantly in his game, he hustles. He really stays locked in. He plays hard. And that can really go a long way with almost any player when you don't love their defensive game. Just getting out there, being the size that he is, and trying can make a difference.
And to get to that hustling point, there were quite a few plays. I can remember 3 offhand where he's behind the play and he catches up to the play and gets the block off the backboard or into the stands. And I think that is absolutely true. He stays engaged. He's not the most fleet-footed laterally. He isn't going to be someone that is going to be strong enough to really body up and prevent people from edging out areas to attack on the drive. But he's someone who knows what they should be doing, but doesn't necessarily have the body to do it yet, I think. So that's
and he's huge. I mean, that the size part of that, yeah.
Absolutely, yeah. He's got measurables that are going to blow people away, I think. I think that the reason to be optimistic about the shooting eventually developing is he does make some tough mid-range jumpers. He's low to mid-40s on those mid-range jumpers, whatever Synergy classifies it as, shorter than 17 and then 17 out to the 3. All of that area, he's in that low 40s mark, which isn't going to, again, great, but it's not as bad as the 3-point numbers would make you believe it might be. So to your point, I think he's good at using those areas that aren't really being used conventionally right now in today's league.
Matas is the kind of guy that I just worry about, especially when we're talking about this high of a pick, because I don't know what he does immediately to get minutes outside of being a high pick. Because I don't really think he's that good at anything right now. I think he's smart. I think he's got good measurables, but I don't know what skill he's bringing to the table that an NBA coach is going to be willing to play him any substantial minutes. He can't shoot. And really, I think the main thing is what James said right at the beginning here. He moves like he's stuck to the floor. I mean, he's the least decisive guy. He doesn't have the overwhelming athleticism to use that to compensate for the lack of decisiveness. He just plays with no speed. So like the first upgrade that he needs to make when he gets to the next level is go. I mean, he needs to move. He needs to get the ball and do what he's going to do. But I worry about him in this range, in the top 8 picks, because I'm just not sure what it is that he's going to bring to the table right now. And I think if you squint, you can see a lot of good players emerging from what the current mold is, the lump of clay that he is right now. But he's just, I worry that he's just not good enough at anything to get any kind of consistent minutes at the next level, even on a bad team.
I kind of get that. I mean, my concern the same with Sarr offensively. I will say to your point about the indecisiveness, that's kind of what I was getting at, where a lot of possessions turn into ISO possessions by Synergy's definition, because he waits that second and a half to see what's going on, kind of decide what he wants to do rather than just rip through, get to your move and do something. So that's going to be the evolution at the NBA level. Can he get into his moves a lot quicker? Get rid of that indecisiveness.
Well, I think there's, James, to that point, I think there's a lot of it has to do with that sort of not necessarily NBA level athleticism. I think his finishing around the rim is like one of those things where you're a little bit concerned because he's not really strong. He's not really like getting rid of defenders. He's not really bouncing off people and finishing through contact. It's a little bit scary. And I think maybe there's some of that is like, could he add a little physicality to his game? Could he add a little bulk to his frame? And then all of a sudden have a tool that he's comfortable with. And I think that a lot of times, and I'm not necessarily saying this is the case, but a lot of times when you see a guy shoot a lot of floaters, it's because he's not entirely certain what else he's going to do. And that just happens to be the area of the floor that teams open up to. I think he's going to have to add something. It has to go one way or the other. I mean, ideally it goes both ways, but I think strength is one of those things that could give him a little bit more of an advantage where he can press and get more decisive because he has a move that he's comfortable with, which I don't think he has right now, by the way.
Just to add on to that, 20% or 20th percentile, on layups at the rim, 64th percentile on dunks. So when he does decide to go up in there and dunk it, he's more accurate than average. And then 81st percentile on tip-ins. So again, that kind of goes. So he knows where he's supposed to be. I think I think Chris is absolutely right about the indecisiveness hampering parts of his game at this point. Chris, I'm going to let you go ahead and open on Ron Holland. What do you think about Ron?
I came into the season hearing so much good stuff about him and immediately was disappointed. And I have to temper my disappointment because I think he could not possibly have been in a worse position to succeed. And so it's important to keep that in mind when we talk about Ron Holland. He's one of the youngest guys in this draft. He's just on a team with no guidance and I mean, it was just a disaster. So the numbers are bad. I mean, just across the board, almost everything is bad. He's got a negative turnover ratio. He's not shooting well from anywhere. And when you watch the games, it's kind of chaotic. I mean, I think just to start on ball, off ball, the shooting's bad right now. I don't think it looks necessarily bad, but the free throw percentage isn't great. He really is a little bit of a gunner, and maybe that's context of the TV. But I think he's pretty comfortable creating shots for himself. He's got a good handle. He's a little herky jerky, but it works. Really good athleticism for a guy who's playing out on the wing. I think he is really comfortable going to the rim, creating rim pressure. He's a little wild, a little out of control, but again, very young, bad situation. And he makes I guess the real problem with him is I think a lot of his decision making is poor or lazy on offense. He makes a lot of bad turnovers. They're almost inexplicable. And on defense, I think he is the kind of guy who has the ability but isn't locked in. And again, that could just be context. It's so hard to know from 10,000 feet because for instance, in the original game against Perth, beginning of the season, I think he was lost a lot of the time on defense and help. He's just kind of all over the place. But when the guy's on ball, when he's starting someone on ball, he locked in a lot of the time. He felt that was a personal challenge, it looks like. And he's able to stay with and almost lock up anybody. There's this incredible play he makes in the second game against Perth, where after 2 games, a game and a half of being completely lost off ball, he sees Alex Sarr catching a ball like in a pick and roll. Sarr's going to the rim. And Holland teleports from the weak side 3-point line to leap up and swat Sarr's shot. Like that was going to be a dunk. Swats the hell out of it. Smacks it right down into the ground. I about jumped out of my seat because where's this guy been for a game and a half? It was insane. So he's a really interesting prospect. And I think a lot of it is just context dependent. And I'm excited to see where it goes. But the lack of shooting success is absolutely alarming at this point.
So I want to jump off the back of that, and I want to say, I don't know if this is hot. I don't know what kind of take how you want to classify this take. I think Holland's fallen too far. I think he started off, obviously, was one of the names that we were talking about, and I think he's drifted down into like late lottery in some places. I've seen like 12, 13, 14. This is not a player that I love. I mean, if you know anything about me, I I'm not so high on potential guy. But the potential for Ron Holland is so massive. He's so athletic. He's so long. He attacks the rim so well that when you look at the G League Ignite, and I mean, to say glorified AAU, I think is too much. It's bad AAU ball. There's not a ton of organization. There's not a ton of, and that's by design. I mean, that's how the team is designed. This is just throw some guys in, let them get some minutes against some big competition. This is not a team that's scheming for anything or necessarily even trying to win games. It's just a showcase for these guys. That is as bad a situation as you can possibly have when you're a player of Ron Holland's caliber. You need to be put into a role. You need to be given a development track. And I think when you look at it in that way, that's what's going to be so valuable for him. Whether it's Charlotte or another team, you have somebody who has a plan for Ron Holland to develop. You know what you want him to be. You know what this massive bouquet of physical tools is, and you start to push him in the direction you want it to be. And playing with Miller and Ball, you limit those shots. You limit those bad passes, those opportunities to turn the ball over, because you're given a pretty strict diet early on when you have guys that have the ball. And to me, when you look at Holland, that's what you want to look at, is a guy who, if we develop him in a smaller role, can he play that role? And I think the answer is unequivocally yes. And this is still a guy, to me, with top 5 talent in this draft. And so it's not a player that I would have loved conventionally, but I think given the sort of weakness, shakiness at the top of this draft class, when you look at what Ron Holland does well, that's a guy that you want to give a chance to and see maybe can he develop as a shooter? Can he develop any sort of shake or shimmy in his dribble game? Because he's just been straight line, head down, bulldozer to the rim. But he can do that. He can accomplish things that way. And when you start to develop him along a track, that question is what he becomes. It really gets into sharper focus. And I think that's the really important part about Holland is put him in an NBA system, give the tools the chance to develop, and let him turn into the player that he could possibly can be. And normally, no, in a regular draft, I would say, yeah, maybe this is guy's too much potential and not enough what I've seen on the court. But with this draft, I mean, I still think you have to look at Holland as one of the top 5 guys just because of what he can do.
Next, we're going to go ahead and move on to Cody Williams. I think Cody is someone who can add to what I was talking about earlier with the lack of transition game that the Hornets have right now. He's excellent transition. He finds ways to get downhill, and when he gets to the rim, he's great there. I do think that there's some aspects of his game that he still needs to build upon to really be a complete wing that I think he could be. The dribble jumpers, he's not looking comfortable to me on any kind of shots off the dribble yet. He didn't actually attempt, or I'm sorry, he only took 4 threes off the dribble for the entire season, and he was 1 of 4 on those threes. So again, I think that there are areas of his game he needs to improve upon, but that's true of every prospect. But the fit-wise, I really think he fits well with the LaMelo Ball and Brandon Miller core. And we've seen, obviously, his brother is someone who has drastically improved their game when he got into the league. And I could see Cody along at least a similar trajectory. Obviously, expecting that same drastic improvement upon getting to the league is a lot to ask. But it's something that, he's going to have to work on. But I feel pretty comfortable saying that he's going to be someone the Hornets can count on early if they're looking for someone who can, at least make an impact year one, maybe towards the end of the season. Could be earlier than that, absolutely. But he's actually someone who I started the year kind of down on. But he just has a lot of weapons, I think, that fit in this core really well. Again, 89th percentile on basket cuts. He was 86th percentile on ISO, but only on 15 attempts with 0 threes in that sample. So, again, expanding his threes beyond spot-ups is something I think he needs to do. But in the meantime, I think he can actually be an impact player who complements what they have and builds upon their weaknesses.
My concern with Williams is the question of like defensive positionality. I don't really know where he defends on the floor. I think he's a little bit too skinny. I think you've seen that in his game. He doesn't really have that like bulk that Jalen has, that he can throw his body in front of people. That obviously can develop. He's a young guy, 19 years old on draft day. I mean, so there's a lot to time to fill out. But I think the question early on for him, and James, you can answer this because you have a really good perspective on him, is like, where is he defending on day one? Is he defending 2s? Is he defending 3s? Is he defending 4s? I mean, it's somewhere in that spectrum, but I don't really know the answer to that. And as he fills out, I think that changes. I think they kind of did this experiment with McDaniels in Charlotte a little bit, where it was like, we don't really know what he defends, but we know that the tools are there. And I think they didn't love the results of that. And I'm not saying that's the same player, but I think that to me is the biggest question of, if you're drafting a Cody Williams, how do you feel about that?
Yeah, Charlotte did not get the right McDaniels in that draft, for sure. They messed up on which McDaniels they got. Maybe it was a communication issue. I don't know. But I think defensively, you kind of hit the nail on the head as far as bulk goes. But I do think he has a frame that he can put at least a little bit of weight on. He's never going to be, an Olympic bodybuilder by any means, but he's definitely someone who can fill it out. I think day one, I think some 2s, some 3s. It depends on the matchup for this Hornets roster where you'd put him. LaMelo is not stopping anybody, so it could be 1s if Cody steps up early. We'll see. So I think that it's a concern, the strength, but it's not something that I think NBA trainers are foreign to, a concern that's foreign to them. So I don't put too much weight on it.
I'll just jump in really quickly on Cody Williams. I'm so excited to see what ends up happening with him, because I think he's good at so many things. And it's so interesting because you look at his numbers. I mean, he's successful at everything almost. If you look at his synergy page, everything is positive, and I think a lot of it is fake. It's so interesting because the handle isn't that good. He drives into traffic a lot and kind of just loses the ball. But I think he's trying, and it's good that he's so young and has the opportunity to do and try a lot of those things. A lot of these guys don't have the opportunity to run pick and roll or push in transition, and it's so fun to see him do that and then be successful, even if it's kind of nonsense. It's not going to work a lot at the NBA level. But I think defensively, I agree with James. I think he's going to come up in guard twos and some threes, not the like apex predator wings. He's just not big enough to do that. But I think he's got fluid hips, like quick twitch kind of hips, and he has those quick little choppy steps to stay with the guards and deal with the quick change of direction guys. He is not the kind of athlete that is going to stay with the De'Aaron Fox kind of speed guys, like the crazy fast guys. But maybe he can guard some of the slower guys, and he's just I would almost bet on him being good. It's just because he's kind of good at so many things. The odds of it all not working out would be really inexplicable, especially I mean his brother's like an incredible story of progression. So you hate to include any of that in the Cody Williams evaluation, any of the J-Dub stuff, but it's the brothers and they come from the same family. You got to think there's some kind of progression, especially when Cody Williams is kind of an aware guy. I mean, he's trying a lot of stuff, and there's not like an awareness issue, I don't think, for him. It's just polish and getting better at all the things he's already kind of been successful at.
To speak to what you said about his synergy numbers just popping off the page, his point per possession ratings going down his synergy page: excellent, excellent, average, excellent, average, excellent, good, very good, average. So he's not really lacking on anything, and he's got quite a few areas where he stands out. I know there's a player, Alex, you were really interested to talk about.
Yeah, I want to talk about Zaccharie Risacher. I think he's a very interesting player. I don't necessarily. Okay, I'll just go ahead and say it. I think he might be the best fit for Charlotte. And the reason why I think that, I don't know that, it really just kind of depends on where they pick in this. Is it 1? Maybe that's too high. Is it 6? This is the perfect place for him. Risacher has shown himself to be a fantastic relocation shooter. He works so hard off the ball. Just his ability to move, his ability to relocate. He's got good footwork as he's kind of pushes himself into the corner. Kind of that like Klay Thompson back pedal thing that he does. I think that's such a big asset when you're talking about going back, James, to what you said early on. You got LaMelo Ball. You want to be a transition team. This is a guy who pushes the floor, runs down to the corner, pushes out, is below the break, is shooting 3-pointers. And to me, that's really, really it's one of the most valuable skill sets in the NBA. So when you have the ability to find a guy like that and you staple some size to the frame, I mean, he's not been the best defensively, but I do think there's some size, some try hard. Those things go a long way to developing a good NBA defender. And when you put the shooting on that, you really have something. Like, he didn't shoot well towards the end of the year. He was hot early on. He kind of tailed off. There's some stuff there. But I think what we saw was a willingness to shoot and an ability to relocate and make it very troublesome for him to guard. And so to me, when you take into account what's on the roster, you kind of slot him in there as a secondary piece to Ball, as a secondary piece to Miller. This is a guy who has a skill set. Like, we went back on other prospects and it's like, well, what does he do well? Well, when you talk about Risacher, the thing he does well is catch and shoot. The thing he does well is relocate, shoot. And we know definitively those are NBA skills. And so to me, I think that's really what makes him the best fit here. And I know we can have a million arguments about best fit but to me, let's look for the one thing that we know is an NBA skill set. Okay, we found a shooter. Great. Let's plug the shooter in. And sometimes it's that simple. I think there's a ton of other stuff we can talk about with him, but that was really the thing that jumped off the top for me.
Let me put this bluntly. I think that the shooting is not as sure as you kind of have put it out there. He was 48% on unguarded catch and shoots, which is obviously great, but then 29% on guarded catch and shoots. So he may be someone who is able to, he brings gravity to the situation because they got to guard him out there.
So
But does he make those tough shots?
Well, I want to hit that point real quick because I think you just brought up the exact thing that is really interesting, the guarded unguarded splits. I think he creates a lot of unguarded opportunities. I think his ability to function off ball, I don't think that it's like, oh man, he shoots on these wide open threes. I think it's the work that goes into getting those wide open threes that makes that number relevant. Anyway, sorry for interrupting there.
No, absolutely. I think that's very fair. I wonder, is he limited to those off the other people's creations, and as you say, creating his own unguarded catch and shoots through his relocation, or do you think there is more to his game as far as a dribble jumper potential? Does he have that potential, or you don't think so?
I don't think he has it right now. I think I have some real concerns about rim finishing, just his ability to kind of get into his shot, like when he has the ball in his hands. I don't love his off the dribble stuff. The development of that, I mean, like there are so many good talent development guys in the NBA. Could he be that guy in 3 years? Yeah, sure. I mean, could anybody? But I don't see that right now in his game. And I do think, to your point, James, like if he can't shoot, maybe there are some concerns. I don't see that necessarily as a problem because I think he can shoot and I think he finds a way to play in the game. But I do think, yeah, like when you ask those questions definitively about what can he do besides those, there are a lot of question marks in the game.
Yeah, and just to add on to your concerns for him at the rim, 30th percentile on layups, 12th percentile on dunks, and it was a fairly sizable actual sample on the dunks, 38 attempts. It's more dunk attempts than you'll see from some people. As we talked last week, Topic had 0 dunk attempts. So 38 dunk attempts in 12th percentile, definitely a little bit concerning, although, that could be a strength thing also, which he can add.
I also think there's some not secondary playmaking, but secondary ball moving stuff here that I really like, the hockey assist stuff. I think he's really good at seeing the floor. Like he relocates to shoot and he finds himself sometimes he'll hit a little dump down off that. He continually scans the floor even as he's looking for his own shot. And I don't necessarily think like this is a guy, you're going to have him attack a warp or you're going to have that like second side action for him as a creator. But I definitely think there's a little bit there where you go like, hey, this guy moves the ball well in sort of that Spursian way of like, let's just continually make sure half second we're doing something, half second we're doing something. And I think that's there. And I think that's a little like when you get, this is the funny part, when you get to, yeah, he's a good secondary ball mover this early in the player prospect, like it's a little troublesome on what the player may be. And I think, James, that's your point is like, I don't really know like what else he's bringing to the table. Yeah, okay, you got me on that one because we're already to like he's a secondary ball mover in the point of the discussion. But I do think that's something that merits like when you're playing like the ideal system for Charlotte, I think, and maybe this ends up being different, is they're running, they're gunning, they're moving the ball. It never gets stuck. They're not really getting into these ISO situations. And that's a guy, I think, who is a plus player in that system, just being able to continually make sure the ball is moving and they're creating transition opportunities. And in the half court, they're playing fast and they're really making sure the ball whips so that they're not attacking a set defense as often.
Speaking of secondary ball handlers, since you were talking about those, someone who I think could be a really good secondary ball handler, we talked about him last week, Reed Shepherd for this group. I also think he could help that transition frequency issue they have by creating more chaos, creating steals, creating blocks that can help them get out in transition. Chris, how do you think Reed Shepherd would fit with the Hornets roster?
I think offensively it's a great fit. I mean, the passing would be between those three guys, Miller, Reed Shepherd, and LaMelo. You'd be thrilled to have those kind of passing and shooting combinations. I think that would be a lot of fun. Defensively is where I'm a little concerned, just because you still don't have a real point of attack guy that is high level. I think at the NBA level, it would put a lot of pressure on Brandon Miller to be that guy. I think unless you're going to go out and get another guy and slot Brandon Miller up a spot in the next couple of years. That's my only concern, but I think offensively it's great.
Yeah, I think you said it, Chris, there, like who guards anybody? That becomes a question. And I love Shepherd. I mean, I think on this podcast said like that he gets number one pick consideration, but I think you have this offensive force, tour de force where they're running and they're gunning and they're shooting and they're doing all kinds of things. And then defensively, they might score 140 and give up 150. So that's a little bit of a concern. I love Shepard. I will go to the wall for him on this roster. I'm a little bit scared as to like what he slots into though.
And so if you were looking for a point of attack defender, Castle obviously is a name that pops to the top of everyone's lists. Do you think Castle could be someone who slots in a little bit better next to LaMelo and Miller?
I love Castle. Like another guy that, again, I maybe said this last week, or maybe I didn't. Number one pick consideration for me. Like I think he, to me, might be the head of the board for me. Castle is just a dude who does everything. I think the question for this roster is interesting, though. I wouldn't ever shy away from picking him. Like I wouldn't lose any sleep for picking him. I do think it goes into like, do you want to do more of what you do well, or are you kind of filling those gaps? And Castle and Ball are big. Castle's a little bit more of a lot more of a POA defender than Ball. So he's the guy who's going to draw that number one assignment. But I think their size makes him kind of interesting if they go that route. And I think he's got a ton of versatility. Chris, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, you said it. I think that's exactly right. And then the third guy on this list is Topic. And I think Topic and Shepard have a little bit of the same issue defensively. You hate to really, because we talked about at the top of the podcast, the foundational guys are LaMelo and Brandon Miller right now. So you have to consider that when you're fitting these guys in. And as much as I like Topic and Shepard, you have this defensive problem where you don't have the point of attack guy. It's so much pressure on Brandon Miller, where I think I think Shepard and Topic would absolutely enhance the offense 100%. I mean, they're both really great offensive players. Shepard differently. I mean, Shepard is like an elite shooter and a good passer. Topic is more of an athlete with rim pressure and a really good passer, and he's going to get you up and running. If the whole focus is speeding up the offense, Topic might be the best option. I don't know. I mean, he's a get up and go. He's running on makes, misses, whatever. So having him and LaMelo and Miller running all the time might be incredible. But it's the same point of attack defense issue. So if you're really concerned about that, if you're filling the gaps between your foundational players like we talked about at the top, Castle might be the best option of those three.
I want to throw another name in here, and I know we're going a little off script, but I think to this point, like if we're going supercharged offense, I think you throw Dalton Connect's name in there and you take a look at him. Like obviously not a defensive liability, like a guy who I think is going to get partitioned out and picked on in high leverage situations. But the scoring, like if you're just looking like, hey, we're going to build an F1 race car of an offense, and we need some guys who can relocate, who can shoot, who can do a little bit of their own thing. I think one of the things we saw Connect struggle with was against long defenders in the Kansas game. Like he just kind of didn't get where he wanted to be, and it was a little bit concerning. I think when Connect is a little off the ball, if he's drawing the fourth best defender, he's a dude who can fill it up. And we'll get more into him later. I don't think he's a super great fit. I don't think if you're picking fourth, you want Dalton Connect. But I do think somebody, if they fall into 7, 8, 9, something there, it's worth considering as long as you're okay with we're gonna score 140 and we're gonna give up what we give up every night.
So yeah, you mentioned obviously not at the top of the order. You wouldn't want Connect. Are there any guys maybe you might be interested in on a trade back or maybe a second trade into the first? I don't know if this is a draft you trade into the first without for extra picks, but is there a trade back possible scenario you see in a player that could fit there?
Yeah, I'll throw some names out. I think Ryan Dunn. I don't know how far back you have to trade to get Ryan Dunn. I think Ryan Dunn's the best defensive player in this draft. I don't, again, not one of those like where I'm going to lose sleep over saying that. I think he's somebody like if you're looking, let's bolster the things we don't do well. Ryan Dunn he smacks a little bit of the Matisse Thybulle sort of like, I don't know what he does offensively, and I'm really worried that maybe it's nothing and we're going to have trouble slotting him in down the stretch. But I think if you're just looking and you're saying like, hey, let's go find a defender, Ryan Dunn is the guy you want to go after. And then McCullough from Kansas. I think McCullough, he's not as good a defender as Ryan Dunn, but I think what he does do is he brings like a sense of like instant impact, this sort of maturity. He's an older guy, he's a senior. He can be a 3-and-D sort of player. I think he's available probably mid-first, 15 to 22, if you're looking in that like trade back range. Another name I really want to throw out, and this is a guy I've loved. I don't think he's coming out in this class, is Colin Murray Boyles from South Carolina. Another just, I believe, incredible defender. I think he's going to go back and get one more year. But if he does decide to like sort of sniff around, if you're picking 20 to 30 and you just want to take a shot on a guy who the tools are there for him to stay on the floor immediately as an NBA level defender, I think he's one you take a look at. Sorry, one more name I just want to throw out here, and then I'll kick it back to you guys. Is Tristan Da Silva from Colorado. He is one of these guys where it's like he can do a little bit of everything. He's a little 3, little 4. He's got great feet. He's a secondary creator from the forward position. And I think he is another guy, talking about instant impact. He's going to show up and play, do something at an NBA level to the point where you're like, okay, yeah, I can definitely see where we're going to get Da Silva into the lineup.
Chris, do you have any names you want to throw out there?
Well, I know one for the second round. I know we've got the second round pick coming up, 42. Oso Ighodaro, I think, is a really interesting name, and I know we've talked about him a little bit in the past. He's a fantastic field guy, and watching him is exhausting in college because I think he's so much better than everybody he plays against in college. It's such an interesting thing because he's big, he's a better athlete, he's smarter than everybody he was going up against. So he constantly was out playing other NBA prospects in college. But he's not big enough, or maybe he doesn't have the shooting to be like a high level prospect at the NBA level. But he's such an interesting fit for like coming off the bench. I like the idea of him being a guy you go to, like a 6th or 7th guy eventually, to really keep things running. It might be really good for a transition. He's a good athlete. He's a good passer. He knows to just keep going, and I just think he's a good fit for this kind of group.
I want to throw in Kashawn George from Miami. I think if you're looking for like theoretical player, which I think we've talked a lot about today, he didn't play a lot of minutes when he was at Miami, but there's some pretty interesting stuff in terms of like he could be a catch and shoot guy. He's got a good feel for the game. When you're picking at 42, like I kind of think that's maybe where you roll the dice and take a shot in the dark. I don't think Kashawn George will be there at 42. I think he's somebody you would, if you really, really liked, you probably get him in mid-30s, somewhere in there. He may shoot up if he has some really nice showing. But I do think that that's a young guy who, if you feel good about like your ability to develop somebody and you have a track that you want him to be on, you're going to get there with him.
To finish up here, let's go ahead and pick who we think would be the best fit for the Hornets currently. Alex, I'll go ahead and start with you.
Yeah, I mean, I think I said it. Zaccharie Risacher, I think, is the guy who's going to be a great fit with them. You may not take them one, you might, who knows. I think a lot of the work has to be done in the lottery of like where Charlotte actually ends up. But I think if I had to choose a guy right now, I think Risacher is the guy who's going to add the most to their offensive game, and I think they just have to double down on that.
And Chris, how about you?
I think at this point, I would lean Cody Williams. Just from a perspective of having someone who can really develop and potentially fill holes defensively, offensively, he can potentially long-term really increase the speed of the team, having a third guy who can be a tertiary ball handler and creator, and can already kind of shoot, and defensively could maybe fill the gap there as a point of attack guy. Or even as he gets stronger, play up a spot. But I think he's the guy that I would be rolling with at this point.
And I think I'm going to go ahead and agree with you here, Chris. I think Cody Williams is the guy who brings the most tools that they can expand upon. And I see the easiest, avenue to improving his weaknesses. Thank you for joining us today on Ahead of the Game. Make sure to subscribe to the channel, share it out so we can get more eyes on it. And if you have any topics you'd like to see talked about, make sure to comment those and we'll try to get to them when we can. Thank you and have an excellent day.